Welcome to MBKM channel, Models, Books, Kits and Movies. I am a skilled aircraft worker and I have worked on Vickers VC-10 and Airbus aircraft. I did my apprenticeship on the Harrier and Tornado GR1 jet engines at Rolls-Royce. I have also worked on aircraft plastics. When I was an apprentice at Rolls-Royce during the Cold War, I served in the British Army Reserve as a radio operator in an attached unit to larger regiments. I served for 5 years and did most jobs in a gunner unit at that time. I like to make plastic kits and scale engineering radio controlled model boats from plans. I built my first plastic kit in 1971. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to press like and hit the subscribe button below. Hermann Göring was born into a dysfunctional family. The Görings lived in a Gothic castle that was owned by his Jewish godfather, who had a 15-year affair with his mother. His father tolerated this liaison between his wife and his son's godfather. At 6 weeks old, Göring's father was posted to a diplomatic position abroad, and he didn't see his mother again until he was 6 years old. This separation from the mother figure would have caused a feeling of abandonment for the young Göring, and this would stay with him until the end of his life. As the young Göring grew into his formative years from infancy, he would have known that there would have been anxieties at home over the affair of his mother with his godfather. This led him into entering a world of fantasy, where his games fed into this with the use of mirrors. He would make his toy soldier army look twice the size and increase his fantasy of safety twice over. Being in control of a large army created peace of mind within him, unlike his home life where there was no stability and his father held no control. Anti-Semitism would have been rife in Europe around the time of the 1900s, as unlike now, there were no real laws against race hatred. Göring, like every other young man in this part of the world at the outbreak of the First World War, joined the army to fight for his country. Firstly, he joined the army as a lieutenant, then chanced it one day after being turned down by the Air Force and flew as an observer with a friend. After this, he transferred to the Air Force. He was the last commander of Baron von Richthofen's Jasta 1 squadron in 1918. Germany felt humiliated at the end of World War I and blamed the Jews for its demise. This led to the rise of communism and National Socialism. Anti-Semitism would have been part of a general casual racism at that time, but no more for many. But in Göring's case, because of his upbringing, this would have ran far deeper within him. Like any other pilot from the armies that fought World War I, Göring was jobless in 1918 and gained a position as a civil pilot flying the Mail in Scandinavia. This is where, after a chance meeting one day, he met his wife Karen. Karen was another fantasist who worshipped the image of the swastika and was involved in a form of the Antichrist of the New Age. Unknown to Karen at that time, this would feed the emptiness that Göring felt as a child and inflate his fantasy behaviour to a level of genocide. The 1920s saw Hitler's failed beer hall putsch, and Göring was wounded in a street battle with the German police. This led him into a morphine addiction that lasted until his final year of life. Once Hitler was established as Chancellor in the mid-1930s, Göring's life as a military and political leader began. Karen passed away from tuberculosis and Göring was left alone. Again, the underpinning of his life was destroyed and only fantasy could fill this gap. In 1936, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, and Göring then went on a path of genocide and self-destruction, wrapped in fantasy and feelings of abandonment. There were two sides to Göring. One side was a man that was larger than life and tied in with the German people. He used props and garish costumes to win their hearts and minds. These props and costumes also fed into his fantasy that protected him from the loss of the mother figure and Karen. The other side of Goring was a man who signed the death warrants of millions without batting an eyelid. How much of a National Socialist he was remains unknown, as he made millions from the regime in stolen artworks and other corrupt dealings. To quote Goring, "I will say who is Jewish and who is not." He was not part of the purest and distant, more mystical idealists like Hitler and Hess. Goring was a deeply insecure criminal fantasist who had separation issues. People like theatre, though, and the German public could not get enough of him. He crowned himself Jägermeister, which translates as Huntmaster, and attended hunt and ecological events wearing a hat with a giant feather. He remarried, and from this marriage there was the issue of a daughter. Goring doted on his wife and daughter, and in some ways this would have helped him with the emptiness he felt from infancy that was deep in his subconscious. In some ways, Goring lived in a different Third Reich from the other leaders. His was one that was full of theatre, where he was the leading man in what he saw as the Nazi production for his own therapy and amusement. The other was non-political, but deeply criminal and psychopathic. He signed orders for what were people who the regime considered racially inferior to be deported to camps where they would be slaughtered wholesale. As an unstable criminal psychopath, he wouldn't have lost any sleep over this, as it was a matter of paperwork for him that in turn fulfilled the fantasy of his version of Nazi Germany. There was no doubt of Goring's guilt, as he was Hitler's second in command. As the war progressed, a gap started to emerge between the two men, as Goring failed to secure control of the air over the United Kingdom for Operation Sea Lion, which was the plan to invade the UK. This had to be cancelled indefinitely, and also the failure to adequately supply a whole army group on the Russian front, which led to over 250,000 men surrendering to the Red Army. As this gap deepened, Goring went back to his villa in the German countryside and appeared to go deeper into fantasy. In one image on here, you can see the real Goring, who looks like a lost child holding a lion cub that he borrowed from the Berlin Zoo. At the very end of the war, Goring was arrested by the SS at his country seat because he thought Hitler, who became paranoid, had committed suicide and took control of the government as number 2 in power. The paranoid Hitler, on hearing this, accused Goring of treason and ordered his arrest. On the news of Hitler's actual suicide in 1945, sometime after, Goring was off the hook and he then goes into denial. His denial comes from the human psyche, where we all have a conscious mind that we greet the world with, a superego, which is a set of rules given to us in our early formative years, and a subconscious, which is a deep pool of values, experiences, personal thoughts, likes, dislikes and prejudices. Very much like an iceberg, we only get to meet the conscious mind with someone and we don't see the subconscious, as this is a huge mass below the waterline, something that is untamed and has no rule. A good example of this is the film A Clockwork Orange, that was withdrawn by its director Stanley Kubrick, as it fed directly to the subconscious mind of some of the moviegoers who watched it. They had very unstable superegos, and this led them to copycat attacks in real life. The film was never banned, but withdrawn. Denial is a mechanism of the brain where, in my opinion, some neural pathways close, which lead to the mind not registering a horrific event, crime of genocide in Goring's case. Even though guilty and responsible for this, Goring's mind could not cope with the enormity of the crime and situation and worked differently from this time on. When Goring surrendered with his wife and daughter by his side, he thought that he could negotiate surrender terms with General Eisenhower. His fantasy was still in place, with denial of his wrongdoings added to it. In another image on the video, you can plainly see that Goering has been arrested that his fantasy bubble has burst by the look on his face. His props and costume have been taken away, and all that is left is a hurt child with murderous and genocidal criminal tendencies. Once jailed and awaiting trial, his criminal side came to the fore, where he manipulated some of the guards who imprisoned him with autographs and gold watches. This was not enough to maintain his psyche, and he committed suicide the night before his execution. If there was doubt in Goring's guilt, which there wasn't, could I have brought him back from the psychological abyss of his life? Reichsmarschall Göring lived his life in turbulent times, and his psychology gave him confidence because of his fantasy. Without this environment and born into our current era, he may have been an extremist on one hand, but also a drug dealer on the other. We all have a saint and a sinner within us, but with Goring's early formative years, these two sides to him would have been inflated to feed his fantasy of being in control. Even with the nature-nurture debate, a change of his environment with the same formative years would produce a similar result. With Hermann Göring, once the fantasy ended, he ended. There would have been no other fantasy to replace the one he had, which in his view he triumphed in. Even if prevented from suicide and if he escaped the hangman's noose, I would have a deeply psychopathic, suicidal and unstable childlike adult to attend therapy sessions with in a controlled environment. No person cannot be redeemed, but in Goring's case there was not an adult to be found, only a hurt and disoriented child who would have needed psychiatric care for the rest of his life. With a controlled, secure and stable environment, he could have survived after the war, but only within this. Psychotherapy on an unending basis would have had some benefit, but with reality and without fantasy, he would have been a broken and pitiful figure in the modern world. Perhaps your assessment of the King of Bling is different. Please leave your comments below. This has been a Models, Books, Kits and Movies production that was written and created by the MBKM channel. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and until next time.